Good. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. Thank you for inviting us to beautiful Maple Ridge and the beautiful facility here. I'm very, very impressed. Anyways, I'm Taco Van Popte, Member of Parliament for Langley. Mark's already done the introductions, but I'll just, by way of further introduction, we have Ed Fast here, who is the sponsor of a private member's bill that we're going to be talking about this evening. And Michael Cooper, who is the Vice Chair of the Parliamentary Committee on MAiD that has delved into the very complex social and public policy issues around medical assistance in dying. And that's what we're talking about here this evening. And looking at the size of the crowd, this is obviously a topic that is very interesting to many, many people. The topic this evening is actually very narrow. It delves into the question of whether Canada's medical assistance in dying regime, MAiD as we call it, should be expanded to make MAiD available to people whose only underlying health condition is a mental illness. Some people, like our Prime Minister, for example, and his Attorney General, answer that question with yes. And they would reason that if medical assistance in dying is available for those who are suffering intolerably of a physical condition or illness, why doesn't the same logic apply for those who are suffering intolerably of a mental condition? But there are people on the other side of the argument, such as my fellow panelists, who, for the reasons that they will explain, are against that notion. Before I give the floor over to them, I want to just give a very brief, high-level overview of the history of MAiD in Canada, how we went from helping somebody to die, being an indictable offense under Section 214 of the Criminal Code, to Canada now, within 7 short years, becoming the most progressive nation in the world when it comes to euthanasia. What happened? Now, we worked very hard in proposing amendments to C7 to build in as many safeguards for the most vulnerable as we could. Eventually, C7 passed through the House of Commons. It went to the Senate. We expected that the Senate was going to ratify it, and that it would then go to the Governor General for royal assent. But big surprise, the Senate amended it substantially, expanding MAiD to include mental illness as the sole underlying condition. We were quite surprised by that. Again, we fought hard. It came back to the House of Commons for further debate, but it passed with the help of the other parties. But importantly, there was a 2-year delay in the expansion of MAiD to mental illness, ostensibly to give the medical profession the time that they needed to build in safeguards and guidelines for the profession. But thanks to the very capable work of our colleague Michael Cooper and the others on the MAiD committee, it became evident in that 2-year period that there was not a broad agreement amongst the medical profession about how to move forward. The Attorney General, David Lametti, at the time, realized that we were coming up to the 2-year deadline and still no consensus and no guidelines in place, so he proposed a 1-year extension. And we agreed with that because we think that an extension is better than immediate implementation. We are now 6 months into that 1-year delay, and we are taking this opportunity to raise awareness with the Canadian public as to what is going on. And I applaud my colleague Ed Fast for introducing a private member's bill, which he's going to come up and talk about in a moment, which would stop the expansion of MAiD for mental illness, because we think that there are much, much better ways to address the mental illness crisis in the country today. So with that, I'm going to ask Ed to come up and tell us about Bill C-314, I think it is.
My bill does something very, very simple. It simply rolls back what Bill C-7 did in including the mentally ill in Bill C-7. My bill does not in any way affect the other parts of Canada's medical assistance in dying regime. Some of you may support the original intention of MAiD, which was to relieve the suffering of those who had intolerable pain, incurable diseases, or or illnesses, and we're on the cusp of death. Now, we're far beyond that, as has already been explained by Teiko. However, my bill would simply roll back the mental illness provisions. And it would surprise you probably to know that today, as I engage with my colleagues from the other parties, especially the Liberals and the NDP, when the vote comes forward in 2 weeks from now, I expect that there's going to be a large number of them that will actually support my bill. A lot of those Liberal MPs are starting to have second thoughts. What on earth did we do? Because there's no consensus within the mental health community across Canada that we should be moving ahead with expanding MAiD to the mentally ill. There's not been a national debate on this. Canadians, when they're polled on this, the latest poll from Angus Reid from a couple of days ago showed that 82% of Canadians have serious concerns about extending MAiD to the mentally ill. And there's a very clear majority of Canadians that say absolutely not. And there's some good reasons for the mental health community not to support moving ahead with MAiD. There are 3 different issues that the mental health profession has been unable to resolve. The first is the issue of irremediability. The question being, can a mental illness be reversed? And the mental health professionals say, we can never say for sure, because there are treatments, there are medications, often it just takes time, but they cannot come to an agreement on irremediability. The second area of great concern within the mental health profession is the issue of suicidal ideation versus a competent decision to choose assisted suicide as the way out. And that fine line, they cannot agree where that would lie. And of course, the challenge is, if you can't find that fine line, we have such an active and aggressive suicide prevention regime within Canada. If you now provide assisted suicide to the very people who are asking for it simply because they're in deep, deep depression, they haven't had the care they need, we're going to lose people that could have recovered. And the third one is the issue of competency. Do the mentally ill have the competency to make a life and death decision like that? Some may, many will not. And again, the mental health profession has not come to a resolution on that. So, where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with a situation where there's no national consensus on extending MAiD to the mentally ill. I think that is something that is clear. I think anyone who wants to challenge that hasn't actually done the research or looked at the polls on this issue. But beyond that, if the mental health profession can't even come to a resolution on the most significant issues that would determine whether someone qualifies for MAiD, why would we take that risk and rapidly move forward with extending MAiD? Where does this lead Canada? We know that veterans have been counseled by this government to apply for medical assistance in dying as an alternative to getting proper treatment for PTSD. That's happened on at least 7 occasions, including it's happened to one Paralympian. So, if we can't even get this right under the current laws, what makes us think that expanding it rapidly?
Ed, you're closer to the end.
Expanding it rapidly is going to improve the situation and protect the vulnerable. What about the poor and the indigent? We know that many, many people are now coming to our food banks across our country asking for MAiD because they want to escape poverty. We know that there are many Indigenous people that are at high risk, at elevated risk. In fact, there was an article in I believe it was the Globe and Mail this past week. It was a member of the Cowichan tribe on Vancouver Island who wrote a passionate plea not to expand MAiD to the mentally ill because it places the Indigenous peoples of our countries at the very highest risk. And at the end of the day, maybe it will go so far as applying to those who are drug addicted on our Vancouver downtown east side. Do we say to them, you know what? Why don't you just take the needle and we'll permanently put you out of your misery? You simply won't wake up. You won't have any more of this misery living in 10 cities. Why don't you just do that? So at the end of the day, the question is, do we as Canadians get serious about providing the mental health and social supports that our vulnerable Canadians need? Or do we cop out by using MAiD as an easy way out? Because there is a utilitarian argument being made in Canada at some of our universities and around the world, especially in places like Japan, that once you've outlived your usefulness to society, you should opt out and basically commit assisted suicide. Just remove yourself as being a burden on society. That is where this is leading, because it will become easier and easier to prefer MAiD over providing the mental health and social supports and the health supports that Canadians need. We have failed the vulnerable if they now are pleading for MAiD as an alternative to those social supports that we owe them.
The question you might be asking is, how did we get here? How did we get to a point where Canada will have the most expansive MAiD regime in the world? How is it possible that in Canada, the policy of the government of Canada, promoted by this government, has been a policy of promoting death for persons who are suffering from mental illness instead of offering them help and hope? And the answer to that is that we have a Liberal government led by Justin Trudeau that is driven by blind ideology, that has put ideology ahead of compassion, but also ahead of science and evidence. And the approach, as incredible as that is, consistent with what an absurd approach. The government said, well, now that we've made the decision to expand MAiD, let's study it. Let's study it. You would think that you would study it first and then make a decision as to whether it was safe or not. But David Lametti and Justin Trudeau did exactly the opposite. They put the cart before the horse. And so what Lametti did is he appointed a so-called expert panel that was supposed to come forward with recommendations on safeguards and standards for the implementation of MAiD in cases of mental illness. And the special joint committee that I served on, among the issues that we studied was MAiD and mental illness. And we studied it last spring, which was a year before, when I say last spring, the spring of 22, before March 17th, 23 date would come in whereby MAiD would expand in cases of mental illness. And had MAiD bothered to have studied the issue and consulted before making such a decision, he would have understood very quickly that it was completely unsafe and inappropriate to expand MAiD in cases of mental illness. The evidence before our committee from leading psychiatrists and other medical professionals was clear. And I want to give you a taste of some of the testimony that we heard, because I think it's important to actually follow the science and follow the evidence. John Marr, a clinical psychiatrist and medical ethicist, stated, quote, "Psychiatrists don't know and can't know who will get better and live decades of good life. Brain diseases are not liver diseases," close quote. Dr. Brian Mashera, clinical psychiatrist and professor at the University du Québec et Montreal, said, quote, "I'm a scientist. The latest Cochrane review of research on the ability to find some indicator of the future course of mental illness, either treated or untreated, concluded that we have no specific ways of doing this. We are relying on the clinical hunch." The clinical hunch. This on a matter of life and death, this on a procedure that once implemented is irreversible because the patient is dead. Dr. Marc Signor, professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, said in the same context, quote, "They could be making an error 2% of the time or 95% of the time in the case of mental illness, on the question of irremediability, on the question of whether someone can get better or not." And that's a real problem for two reasons. It's a problem by virtue of the criminal code, because in order to qualify for MAiD under the law, one must suffer from a grievous and irremediable condition that is further defined as an incurable disease or illness in an advanced and irreversible state of decline. So if you can't accurately determine whether someone can get better, that raises a whole lot of questions of compliance with the criminal code as it stands. Beyond that, of course, what it means is that vulnerable persons will have their lives prematurely ended. Vulnerable persons who could go on to lead healthy and happy lives. And instead, we have a government that was prepared to go full steam ahead with such an expansion on the basis of the clinical hunch, in which the error rate could be as high as 95%. And as Ed noted, the blurring of the lines between suicide assistance and suicide prevention is equally problematic. It is difficult, according to the experts who came before our committee, to determine whether someone who is suffering solely from an underlying mental health disorder is making a rational request or is making a request motivated by suicidal ideation. And we know that of Canadians who tragically commit suicide, 90% of people who commit suicide suffer from mental illness. And we also know that suicidality is a symptom of mental illness. So unpopular is this policy of expanding MAiD in cases of mental illness with the experts, with the psychiatrists and medical professionals, that a 2021 survey of Ontario psychiatrists by the Ontario Medical Association found, as far as the results go, that 91% of psychiatrists said, no, MAiD should not be expanded in cases of mental illness. Do you know what percent of Ontario psychiatrists said it was appropriate? 2%. 91% against, 2% for. 7% were undecided. You couldn't, if that is about as close to a scientific consensus as you're going to find, 91% to 2%.
I want to say thank you again to our guests, Michael Cooper and Fess, and Take Over Popped Up. We give them thank you very much for coming out. And thank you for your concern. Sometimes I think as citizens we wonder what can we do, but it's coming out, it's speaking up, it's doing the work day in and just in your realm of influence. You can't have that influence, and I just say thank you for your participation and for coming out this evening. So with that, we'll close this part, and we will be mingling here. Happy to talk with anybody on this issue or anything else. And again, thank you for coming this evening.